Hi, everybody. If you're here for Science and Nature Untapped, you are at the right place. So just before we begin, for everyone who's tuning in from Facebook Live, just a bit of housekeeping. We love to know where you're from. And also, if you have any questions, you can put them in the comment box and we'll get to them at the end of the presentation. And I'll just bring your attention here to this photo of a smallmouth bass and a school of yellow perch taken here in Cornwall, Ontario. Just this kind of exciting moment to see so many fish in one place and the bass taking advantage of this group of yellow perch. So I'll just do a little countdown for Gabe from your TV at Kojiko. So Gabe, 3, 2, 1, it's all yours. So hi, everybody, and welcome back to Science and Nature Untapped, a free virtual monthly speaker series brought to you by the River Institute. My name is Stephanie Hildebrand, and I'll be your host for this evening. Before we begin, we'd like to acknowledge that many of us are living on unceded land and traditional territory of Indigenous peoples. We are grateful for the opportunity to live where we do, and we thank all the generations of people who have continued the responsibilities to Mother Earth since time immemorial. You may have noticed that in my land acknowledgement, I do not speak of a specific nation, and I do that because I might be having people tuning in from anywhere around the world. For myself, I live and I work on Mohawk territory. If you'd like to know whose land you're living, working, or visiting, I highly suggest visiting the website at www.native-land.ca. If you're interested in learning more about what the River Institute does, the kind of research we conduct, educational programs, and future events, you can follow us on social media. So we are on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Also, if ever you wanted to watch a previous presentation from Science and Nature Untapped, you can go to our website. So River Institute. I put .com, but actually it's .ca. I'm sorry. So riverinstitute.ca/untapped, and then you'll be able to find all of our videos there. So for upcoming events in terms of Science and Nature Untapped, we're taking a summer break. So July and August, we won't have any events for this specific programming, but we'll be back on September 7th with a new lineup of speakers. So we're looking forward to seeing you there. And so a lot of our events, our research, and our programs are generously supported by donors. If ever you wanted to make a donation to the River Institute, you can do so at riverinstitute.ca/donate. But also just, talking to your friends about us, sharing our social media. I mean, just word of mouth goes a really long way in terms of support and getting word out about the work that we do on the St. Lawrence River. So for this evening, we'll be hearing about stories of coastal resistance and the climate crisis with Dr. Philip Loring, who's an associate professor in the Department of Geography, Environment, and Geomatics at the University of Guelph, where he holds the Arrell Chair in Food, Policy, and Society. A human ecologist, his work focuses on the intersection of sustainability, food systems, and social justice, primarily in coastal settings. An avid science communicator, Loring emphasizes writing, film, and other forms of storytelling to reach diverse audiences. His book, Finding Our Niche, won a gold medal from the Independent Publishers Awards and a silver medal from the Nautilus Book Award, and his TEDx talk, No More Heroes, has received over 100,000 views. So thank you so much, Philip, for joining us tonight. And without further ado, it's all yours.
Thank you very much, Stephanie, for having me, and thank you everybody in the audience for being here. I appreciate it very much. Thank you for that kind introduction as well. As Stephanie said, my name is Phil Loring, and that was an excellent comprehensive introduction, so I'll spend no more time on who I am, except to say that I'm coming to you all from the traditional lands and treaty lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit, which is also widely known as dish with one spoon territory. And I share that because the dish with one spoon covenant is a very applicable metaphor for the kinds of work we do around food systems, recognizing that we are all standing in the same circle around the same set of resources that we need to steward and rely on and work together in order to make this life of ours more healthful, more just, more fulfilling, and relate in a good way to our non-human neighbors. I will now share my screen, if that's all right, and get started on my talk. So today I'm going to talk to you all about a variety of observations and research that I've done over the years, over the last 16 years or so, working in coastal communities, trying to understand, cope with, and respond to the impacts of climate change and the climate crisis. But as I'll talk about in a minute, it's really important to recognize that the impacts that communities are experiencing on the coast are climate, but there are also other things. There are COVID-19, their development, their ongoing conflicts over the status of unceded territories. There's all of this complex milieu of issues that are making it challenging for people in coastal communities to have secure and thriving livelihoods and to steward coastal resources in the way that they see fit and that can help strengthen our communities and our society as a whole. Again, we've sort of already heard about me. The only things I'll note here, rather than putting it at the end, so we can focus at the end on questions and discussion. Stephanie mentioned my book, Finding Our Niche, which some of you after this may find interesting. And also, if you're interested in how we navigate radical change in a rapidly changing world, I also have a podcast called the Second Transition Podcast, which helps sort of encourage conversations about how change works, what change is like, what radical change might look like on the other side. So if you are listening to this, if you're a citizen of this planet, the odds are 1 in 3 that you live on or near a coast. 40 to 50% of people live within 100 kilometers of a coast or a coastal feeding waterway. Coasts are hugely important. And because they're interfaces of all sorts. They're natural interfaces between the land and the sea. They're cultural interfaces. They're places where cultures and communities and cities have been born, have risen and fallen. And we have so much invested in them in multiple different senses in terms of our traditional knowledge and stories and cultures, but also this society that we live in right now has so much capital invested in them in an economic sense. The future of the coasts, where go the coasts, go the rest of the world. And those coasts are significantly under stress. And I like to talk about this a little bit, but I don't like to spend a lot of time on the bad news because I feel like we get the bad news from everywhere around us all the time. And it becomes a bit of a white noise where, well, yeah, it becomes hard to know what to do with it or how to target that information into what we can do about it. But just to really emphasize, the coasts are so much of our shared human experience, and they really are this nexus of all of the impacts that we're experiencing, but as I'm going to say, all of the opportunities that we have to respond in new and novel and innovative and revolutionary ways to challenges like climate change. A couple of things I want to sort of give to you up front for this conversation moving forward, and these are two things that I've sort of come to understand over, again, 15, 16 years of working with coastal communities. And that's when something weird happens. It's not, and a community on the coast, a community anywhere really, has to respond to a challenge, a flood, a big atmospheric river that knocks out a bridge in British Columbia, a flood that floods out an agricultural field and kills livestock, or a shutdown of seafood supply chains because of COVID-19. Whatever that impact is, whatever that particular crisis is of people in a community, a coastal community, are trying to respond to, it's important to recognize that nobody's responding to these new things that occur in a vacuum. There's life already going on. There's the ongoing work of managing our communities, keeping them safe, keeping them healthful, trying to make them better, trying to improve them, trying to improve education, trying to rebuild infrastructure, trying to make things better. We're always trying to do that. I call it community work. And we're all, because we're always working on those things, sometimes things are easier, sometimes things are harder. But I tell you, of all of the community managers I've met in coastal communities, what I know is that whenever crisis happens, they're not just sitting at their desk wondering, nothing's going on today. Most people are already working on 10 things and barely have room for anything else. And so I like to think about this idea. It's kind of a borrowing from ecological science of the carrying capacity, that communities are, you never know when a challenge hits, what capacity people are going to have to respond. It may be pretty significantly depleted already by a food shortage, or maybe a toilet paper shortage, or whatever the thing is. You never know what people are going to be able to bring to this new surprise. So let's keep that in mind as I talk throughout this conversation. And then the second thing that I think is important to sort of carry through this whole conversation is this notion that came out of a Canadian federal document about responding to climate change, of an adaptation deficit. The idea being here is that we've dithered for so long in trying to do something and not doing something about climate change, and that we've locked in all of these challenges that had we acted 10, 15 years ago, we wouldn't have to respond to. We now face a deficit of investment. We face a deficit of the things we already didn't do, the inactions we've already not acted on, that set us up for more urgent challenges. And so when I think about a community who's already operating on the coast, already operating with challenges all around them, and now they're facing, in some cases, devastating impacts of climate change, interacting with all these other things, as I mentioned. It's this notion that you have people in communities who do their best, and they're working for the best for their communities, but not only on their back foot, but they're operating at a deficit. And so two things that I want to keep you thinking of, keep in mind as we think about the pathways that are in front of us, the ways that we move to get ahead of a challenge like climate change in the way that it intersects with all of these other issues that coastal communities are going to face. And in particular, what I want to draw, as a social scientist, one of the things that I have to be constantly attuned to is the issue of social and environmental justice, and recognizing that it's very easy to say climate is changing, we've missed an opportunity to ameliorate some of the impacts that are ahead of us. Therefore, there's some things we're going to need to adapt to. There's some things we're going to need to bear and be resilient to. And what I want to avoid in this conversation, and help you all be more attuned to in terms of thinking about how people propose solutions, whether it's economic solutions, political solutions, is this line between adaptation, acknowledging we need to do something. We need to respond. We need to change the way we do certain things in order to make our communities more safe in the face of challenges like climate change. And the line between that and acquiescence, that climate change is happening, it's just going to happen. And this is important, I think, because early on in the climate literature, as a climate scientist, and I'm a social scientist, but I've worked in climate impacts for a long time. And I remember in 2005, 2006, 2007, when I was writing then academic papers on the impacts of climate in the Arctic, reviewers, I would invariably get a reviewer who was grumpy about the fact in my paper that I didn't also talk about the opportunities and benefits that come from climate change, because there was still this sort of naive assumption of what it was going to be, and that it was going to be sort of this sort of, well, we can manage it, but what if it happens? Why don't we just, and acquiesce to it, make our policies for whatever the new future is going to be. And there's a lot of harm and injustice at the core of that, which I'll talk about. But just keep those things in mind. This fine line. Yes, we have to adapt, but are the changes we're making, are they adaptation? Are things we're doing that we need to do, or are we acquiescing to the problem? And I ask that, it's been about not quite a year now, but because I remember I was particularly a watershed moment for me in thinking about my own role in helping people understand and respond to climate change was watching very closely the COP26 in Glasgow last year, and feeling like the conversation was sort of a mimeograph of the carbon copy of the way that it had been for years and years and years prior, and that the calls for adaptation were escalating, but the actions regarding, how do we acknowledge the harms that are ongoing in communities like Tuvalu, and here you see the Tuvalu Prime Minister addressing COP26 in a very symbolic fashion, because who's going to be underwater in 15 years. The acquiescing to the fact that that is the normal right now, and realizing that this is not a future thing anymore, that we can, the ability to talk about climate change as being in the future, but it's happening now. And then I watched the words of the Tuvalu minister, and it's on YouTube. I encourage you to find it. What I realized watching this particular address was that there's we often use the phrase frontline, and I'm not a fan of militaristic metaphors, but we often use the term frontline to talk about how the communities that are being impacted first. But what I realized in listening to him was that there's a double entendre with that term, is that the front line can also be the communities who are going to be most empowered to do something. And again, I started this conversation by talking about how coastal communities are, or within 100 kilometers of the coast, that's nearly a majority of people on this planet. And so there's people in coastal regions who are going to impact this first. And I want to move at least some of you in the audience to thinking about how, oh, that's terrible, how do we help them cope, to, oh, they're right there and they are the best chance we have if we support them of stopping this runaway train. That's the pivot from a vulnerability and an impacts sort of mindset to a bouncing forward and agency in the face of change, a radical agency change mindset about addressing climate change. So why coast? Why now? The other thing that's happening in a coastal setting for people who maybe work in this area or pay attention is that with the urgency of climate change, with the immediacy of the need to find solutions for our food systems, for example, which globally contribute about a quarter of global climate emissions, how do we make our food systems more climate friendly, as a lot of people are talking about that in this new concept of the blue economy has emerged. So globally, people have started to look at the ocean and coastal communities sort of being the step off point for developing this new carbon positive or carbon proactive economy. And on the one hand, that's great, because again, that sort of is what I'm saying, is that this is the locus for doing something about climate change. On the other hand, you can imagine what happens when you bring all manner of different corporate interests into coastal regions around the world that are already in that first slide, as I showed you, or those first slides that I showed you, on their back feet in terms of dealing with day-to-day issues and already operating at an adaptation deficit because they're standing in water. So you have this, everybody realizes, and some people realize there's a profit center there to be developed. There's an opportunity to make money in coastal adaptation and developing this blue economy. And that's climate adaptation, but is that climate adaptation that's working for coastal communities? Thinking about all of these issues, again, to me, it always circles back to both that we are addressing the environmental and climatic problems, and are we addressing them in a way that supports communities and builds social justice instead of increasing disparity. And the reason that I say that is because one of the things that we've learned since the Brundtland Report in 1985 started to popularize this concept of sustainability. We've learned this the hard way through fisheries, through conflicts in lobster fisheries in Newfoundland. I worked for 10 years on fisheries in Alaska that had the same problem, where what we've learned, we have really sort of, the knowledge still stings, I think, to some extent, for a lot of people who devoted a lot of their time to sustainability. I still do. But the trouble is, sustainable doesn't necessarily mean ethical, and doesn't necessarily mean just. That's the takeaway from the last 15 years of sustainability science, as best I understand it. It's entirely possible to concoct governance regimes that manage a fishery, that make sure you never drop below maximum sustained yield. But you can't ensure that that system is going to make sure that everybody has equal access, or equitable access, rather. You can't ensure that that system is going to address past harms of colonialism and the dispossession of Alaska Native people or indigenous peoples elsewhere, outside of Alaska, from those fisheries. And so it's important, but it's not enough. And when I think about responses to climate change, I want us to learn this lesson here and not have to replicate this lesson in climate action. We may find fancy ways to address climate change in the short term, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they address some of these root causes of social and environmental justice that accompany climate change. And so on a critique of those other solutions, it's just saying, let's learn from what we learned in the sustainability movement, that it only gets you so far, and then maybe recenter some of these concerns about empowering communities to solve problems on their own. So over the years, working in coastal communities, in responding to challenges, I've a couple of points have come out that I'll talk to you about, and that one is this notion of tipping points, that there are undesirable thresholds that communities don't want to pass, and they do whatever they can to cope to keep that from being passed. Now, if you think about an indigenous coastal community in rural Alaska as an example, one of the last things they want is to lose their school. If people are moving away, because you lose the school, that changes the whole demographic situation for that community, and you lose resources and whatnot. Or losing a store is another example. And so as we think about the communities responding to change and that baseline carrying capacity, the more these impacts come, the more they're going to erode communities' ability to focus on the things that matter most. So we talk a lot about being resilient to these challenges. And if I can do something with this talk, hopefully I help you realize the important difference between bouncing back and the implications of what it means to be harmed and bounce back from it, or to bounce forward, to be impacted by or to experience some shock or harm or challenge, and to have what you need, and for your community to have what it needs at its disposal to make radical change through that crisis so that those impacts don't happen again. There's a metaphor that I use often to sort of get that across, is that a lot of people talk about building resilience, and it's important. It's no doubt important. We're tremendously resilient people or beings. We have the psychological ability to normalize great harm and objectively poor circumstances. But being resilient at the same time in a context like climate change, it's kind of like being punched in the face. It's great that you're resilient because you want to heal, right? You want to recover from that. But having been resilient to that effect does nothing about the fact that you were harmed in the first place. There's nothing about the fact that you had to move out of the way next time to not get punched a second time. If somebody's still throwing the punches, being resilient to those punches does nothing about that. And that's what I'm getting at with this notion of acquiescence through adaptation. If we're emphasizing harms from climate change in coastal communities by saying, just move out of the way, there's nothing about the fact that you had to move. So again, thinking back to where I started this, people in coastal communities, or communities everywhere really, are constantly working to make their lives better of people in their community, to improve infrastructure, to improve schools, to improve whatever it is, right? There's a trajectory that people in a community have. There's a vision for the future. When a punch gets thrown, when climate change comes, that trajectory that people had in mind is altered. There's a future that people are working towards that is potentially lost. And that's the harm that is often unspoken when people talk about the impacts of climate change. And I think if we started thinking more about those lost futures that are the result of having to step out of the way of these punches, I think we'd be a little bit more, we'd put a little bit more gravitas to just what it means to have to adapt to climate change, especially in communities that did not cause this problem in the first place, which is the case for the majority of small rural coastal communities around the world. One other note on resilience is that very rigid institutionalized systems can be very resilient. And so being resilient is great, but being resilient might also work against us for finding better solutions. And I think about, for example, the disruptions that we saw recently in shipping on the West Coast. The supply chains were clogged for quite a long time, and people got by. As I'll talk about in a minute, alternative supply chains sort of filled in the gap. We found ways around it, but nothing at the global level really changed to respond in a way that in the future might be different. So we were resilient, yes, but what that meant is that we were able to get away one more time and get deeper into this adaptation deficit by just bearing it and not responding. And that makes systems hard to disrupt. And so here's Hurricane Katrina, which is a long time ago, and this is a great example of what I'm trying to get to. When Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans, New Orleans in the United States was known for having among, I think there were 49 out of 50 states in terms of failing public school systems. But at the same time, they were tremendously hard to change because they were institutionalized, they were political, they were being controlled. There was no political will to change those school systems. Katrina wiped parts of New Orleans off the map, right? Everything had to be rebuilt, including the schools. And that disrupted this system so much so that people who wanted to institute reform could, in a way that they never were able to before. Unfortunately, for those who were proponents of better access to public school systems, the people who had the political will to reform the school systems after Katrina were those who were interested in charter and private schools. And so the mandate there and the people who were able to influence change pushed that system in a direction that maybe not everybody thought was equitable or just. But the lesson still is that here was a system that was unable to change until you had a disruption. And so we learned something from when systems are shocked and people are experiencing these harms and these challenges, there are still these openings, there are still these niches that open to do something different. And so what would it mean if we built policy, if we built our solutions and empowered people who are in the most position to effect change, to improve communities, people living in coastal communities, if they were prepared at the onset, the next crisis that hits you, where there is going to be one, here are the tools you need not only to get through it, but to change, learn from it and change things so that you don't have to respond, you don't have to be impacted in the same way in the future. And so importantly, my sense as a person who's been working on global food systems for a long time is that these institutionalized systems, our food systems, our shipping systems, our supply chains, all these things that I just a moment ago said are so resilient that it's hard to disrupt the status quo. There's only a point, there's going to be a tipping point at which these systems can't handle it anymore. And that, I think, again, creates alternatives for people who want to do things differently. And so this is where I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about some research that we did on how people in coastal communities responded to disruption, and some lessons that I think we can take forward from that research to community action, to planning, to ways that people in coastal communities can say, we're going to build our capacity right now. So when the next opportunity comes to change whatever it is, X, Y, or Z, we're ready. And that research was in communities working on fisheries, and particularly alternative seafood networks, where instead of just being resilient, this is where I started to see people mobilizing their resistance and saying, no, we're going to take this opportunity to try to not just bounce back and to cope. And, oh man, this was a terrible year. We're going to measure our losses. We're going to lick our wounds and we're going to come back and do things before. But how do we take this opportunity actively to do things different and to try to change the system in which we're working? And so let's do a bit of a back and forth on my slides here. So what happened in the first year of the pandemic with seafood systems, global seafood systems, is that we saw a global system-wide shock. We saw trade stoppages, China closing its borders. We saw people not being able to go to restaurants. And all of this had impacts across the global seafood system, from large-scale operators all the way down to small-scale operators and also consumers. But the impacts were different. It was very interesting. So, large-scale international seafood networks were essentially halted because major trade borders were closed. There were labor issues. You couldn't put people on these large vessels together because of social distancing and whatnot. And so you saw this disruption at the global level of flow. And one of the things we see over and over in food systems is when the global systems of food trade are disrupted, the local ones fill in that gap. And so instead of all of us getting our seafood, in this case, from the counter at a Longo's or a Loblaws or whatever, people started getting seafood locally if they could and if they could afford it. This is a pattern we've seen in other aspects of the food system as well, whether it's because of a fuel price crisis or because of a economic downturn. Whenever you see a disruption in the global food system of food, you see local systems fill in. So there's that resilience, right? There's that people who are picking up the slack. But when COVID hit, people working on alternative seafood networks, and by that I mean people who were doing community-supported fisheries or direct delivery of fisheries or marketing at farmers markets or finding other interesting ways to get sort of their small-scale artisanal style fishing to consumers. All of a sudden, everybody wanted what they had. And there's lots of reasons why people were able to respond to that or not. And that brings us to these three pathways. And this is what I have in mind here. When an impact comes, are people coping and just dealing with it? Are people reacting, or are people adapting? And I don't need to get into the long sort of version of the explanation of these three different pathways to change. But the most important point is if you're stuck. If you're stuck in a position where you can just cope, the best thing we can do for you is try to help you find a way to move from coping to reacting, instead of internalizing the harm or the impact to reducing the harm. And if you are only able to react, the best thing we can try to do is move you from reducing harm to building help, to building alternatives. And that is what some people anyway, working in the alternative seafood network community were able to do in response to this shock of COVID-19. So again, here's another sort of visualization of what an alternative seafood network is. And so you have this one international trade icon here, the large-scale dominant system of wild-caught fisheries and aquaculture, so all in a very metaphorical way gets funneled into this same system of network and trade. And eventually, one way or another, whether it's the store or whether it's from a food service company to restaurant, that food ends up on your plate. The people who are trying to build this alternative niche are working through lots of other pathways by what that seafood gets to you. Sometimes restaurants, and again, restaurants, when COVID happened, restaurants were the first thing that everybody closed. So the biggest market for one of the biggest markets for the alternative seafood networks closed because of COVID and social distancing. Major stress. But this is sort of a conceptual rendering of what I mean when I say alternative networks. But what we found when we worked with, I think we worked with 60 or 70 different people working in seafood during this time, we kept checking in to see what they were doing and how they were responding. And we discovered that there were some circumstances that made it possible for fishers to be able to adapt more quickly, to pivot, to scale up what they were doing, or to build new networks to store fish in freezers, or to get more fish to communities, or to, well, I can't sell my fish right now because the restaurant is closed, but I can get it into the local school food program, even though schools are closed, or sending meals home so I can get the lobster to them, or whatever it is. We found these three categories of things that made a difference for whether or not, a particular fisher working out of Bristol Bay in Alaska or off the coast of BC, British Columbia, harvesting wild scallops, whether or not they were able to take the disruption as an opportunity. And I'll focus on a couple of those things here, because I think some of these are more obvious leverage points that we can support as their neighbors and their customers and people, talking to, voting in provincial elections and local elections and federal elections. And one of those things is building the capital that these smaller outfits need to compete in an industry dominated by policies that are designed and tailored to regulate large-scale organizations. One of the biggest barriers that we found among local operators was that the features of like food safety policies and other regulations that were tailored specifically to the challenges and problems of large-scale fishing wouldn't apply to small-scale fishing, got in the way. And so building our society in a way that supports local food systems, local community food systems and networks to empower sharing of food and create these opportunities seemed to be a real big important difference, because in cases where fishers had access to strong networks, in cases where fishers already had, like for example in the States, there's a community of practice called Local Catch. And Local Catch Network, before the pandemic hit, had, I think it was about 90 or so members of the network who were trying to market their local catch in a different way. And they were sharing their experiences with how to set up this new business model or that new business model. And the pandemic hit and everybody flocked to them and asked for help. What do we do? How do we learn from you? And there's nearly 400 members of Local Catch now. And so that existing network and community of support and practice made it really critical for all of these other people who had an opportunity to pivot but didn't know how or didn't know what to do, to draw on that social capital and that information and the learning that other people, the ups and the downs that other people had already gone through, to change their business model and respond. And all of this, this is sounding very sort of theoretical or academic right now, but this played out in a matter of a couple of months. In the first year of the pandemic, all of this happened so fast; it was really remarkable. And I say that because building capital and building networks, one of the biggest critiques I always hear about these suggestions that a social scientist makes for change is that it takes too long, that it's too slow, that social change is too slow, that behavioral change is too slow. And what people in these networks saw is that it wasn't. These networks mobilized quickly. They grew really fast. Consumers switched very rapidly to saying, okay, yeah, sure, I'll learn how to cook fish at home, but who do I follow on Instagram to figure out how to do it, right? But it happened really quickly. And then the question now for a lot of these people working in this space is, how do we keep these gains? We don't just want to go back to what things were like before the first year of the pandemic. We fundamentally changed our market space and how we do business, and we want to keep that change and transform it and grow this new alternative in the seafood system. And so what I take away from that experience and doing research with this community is kind of twofold. Is that there are seeds of change already everywhere. My book, Finding Our Niche, for example, when I first set out to writing that book, I thought I was looking for win-win scenarios where people in nature thrive together, and I thought I was looking for unicorns. And what I found out is that no, I was just looking for colts. They were everywhere, and the seeds of those change area. But you also need to focus. So it's people having a great idea and a different approach to doing things are all well and good. But if they're trying to do so, like if you're a farmer trying to do something different on an abandoned piece of land that is, it has so much remediation you need to do, and all the policies are stacked against you, and it's impossible to enter the markets. And right, so you also need the soil, you need the environment around these innovations to be nurtured as well, to help people expand their niche space and in order to experiment. And when one thing that we know for certain, there's pictures here of different programs in different parts of Canada, like Fishing for Success in Newfoundland and Labrador. One thing that we know for certain is that all of the crazy things that we've seen in the last few years, things are just going to get crazier. That is the nature of major systemic change, is that things get more divergent and there's more stuttering, more variability in the world before whatever is going to be on the other side of this great transition that we're going through appears. And so support the people, but also look around and say, what are the decisions that are being made right now that might be cutting off our future options? And I was saying to somebody earlier today in an interview that one of the most important decisions we can make when it comes to whether it's about building a highway or about making a new fishery policy or whatever it is does that close options or open them? We don't know what the options are going to be right now in a future of uncertainty, but we know our ability to respond to them is diminished if decisions we make right now limit those potential futures. And so that's what I mean by nurturing the seeds in the soil. And then one of the things I will say for those of you in the audience who are inclined towards trying to find major change in the world and look around and think, God, we're further away than ever. Things feel like they're getting worse and worse and worse. And, the place that I draw optimism in trying to address issues like climate change is, as a systems thinker, I know that when you're right at the threshold of change, things seem worse than ever. When you're pushing that hill, that rock up the hill like Sisyphus, you're so tired at the top. It's the steepest it's ever going to be. You can't see on the other side of that boulder to know that you're super close. So from a systems change perspective, this is how I stay optimistic about thinking like big challenges, like climate change. Maybe that's a sort of helpful for some of you. And then finally, this is a new slide that I just added because I've spent some time working with an artist and activist named Ricardo Levins Morales in Minnesota, in part for the podcast, but for some other work that we're doing. And his theory of change is very much about a volcano, and that power comes from below. You don't even know that it's there, and organizing and reorganizing until it springs forth and changes the world. And so, as a scientist, I'm simultaneously a scientist and an advocate, and this is the space I want to work in and there's lots of people working in that space. And so I encourage you, if you care about addressing climate change and being a part of coastal communities that not just respond to this challenge, but also address it in those solutions. Find those other people in the lava who are just below the surface doing so. And then when that opportunity springs, you can spring forth with your new idea. I'll stop there with a little bit of time, I think, for conversation and questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Phil. And thank you for ending on such a positive note, because, often it feels like, it does feel like there's this resistance, and it could be easy to feel like, well, there's nothing I can do. So thank you for taking the time, and again, ending on that note. I'm going to open up the floor to questions. I guess I got a couple comments from our viewers. So there's one of our viewers who's watching from his kayak in Maitland. So that's kind of exciting. And we have somebody watching from the Everglades in Florida.
Lovely.
So yeah.
No, that is, I spent 12 years living in South Florida. The Everglades are beautiful.
Yeah, that is a trip I would like to make eventually. I guess maybe just a really simple question to start with. So you had mentioned a podcast that you have, and I was just wondering, and for the viewers, where can they listen to the Second Transition podcast?
Sure. Well, the short answer is just about anywhere that you get your podcasts. I use Good Pods, which is sort of an independent. It's on Apple, it's on Google, and should be just about. There's a possibility that I've missed a podcatcher or a platform that I haven't heard of, but it should be on most of them.
Okay, awesome. So I guess for me, my comment while I'm waiting for questions. So I'm sure that quite a few of us are viewing from the St. Lawrence River, and I don't think we have felt the impact of climate change as much as coastal communities have yet. And I just thought that this presentation, like in some ways, we're fortunate to have had this presentation so that we can think about these things before it really hits us hard, before we have, before we're just struggling to stay, above the surface. So it's just something that I was thinking about. Yeah,
and for people living in this part of Canada, along the St. Lawrence, moving into Ontario, I think it's important to realize that as a extremely verdant, relatively temperate part of the world, and all things being equal, highly developed, but not by comparison to other places, this is where people are coming. And unchecked climate change is going to make lots of more people be on the move. And I can tell you right now, where are they going? They're going where there is fresh water and green plants, and it's not 45 degrees Celsius in the middle of summer, right? And so that's another example of a pressure. It's not quite the same as a storm that washes off your pier, but it's another one of these things that I think that we're going to have to anticipate. Maybe in some of the urban areas, you could say we're already experiencing that climigration, as some people call it. It's a gift to be in such an environmentally secure locale. That is, we're not going to be, people are going to want to come here. Already do want to come here. This is going to be, the downside is, like it or not, some people are going to have to move, it seems. The upside is, I really think that we can avoid most of it. But either way, I think that we need to recognize that in addition to environmental challenges and forcings, we're going to start seeing more people saying, oh, if we go there, we'll be safe.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good point to bring up, and it reminds me of a conversation I had with Abraham Francis from the Mohawk Council of Akwesasne, and that's what he had said when talking about climate change. It was preparing for people to be coming to this region, and you just echoed that. So thank you. I'm gonna just check the questions. Sorry, I'm gonna have two screens going. So. Okay, so I do have one here. from Philip Ling. He's asking, or he says, as you mentioned, equity is often not part of climate solution development. How do you bring equity into the mix that seems to be due to silos?
That's a good question and a very good point. And the silos that I would say that are the ones we really want to focus on are what I've heard some people recently describe as like carbon tunnel vision. That it's easy to focus on a single one or two aspects of the problems we face. That's not a whole systems view, right? But it's been a very hard sell over the years, helping people connect with the idea that problems like climate change and other environmental challenges they're anchored to root social problems, right? And so if you can build a consensus around the need to multi-solve, to say, we're not just going to address carbon emissions, we have to address carbon, but we also have to address biodiversity. We also have to address access to land. We also have to address food security and the rights that are involved in the right to food, right? To some people, they hear that and say, oh, well, that's intractable. But if you take a systems perspective on that, you see, oh, it turns out if you draw a quick little diagram, all these things are related in these two or three things, and they relate to ensuring that everybody is safe, ensuring that people have access to food. Oddly enough, when people are safe and secure, their ability and desire to network and collaborate over stewarding the environment around us goes way up. And so, the refrain wherever I go is multi-solve, multi-solve, multi-solve. Recognize that your solutions are going to be more durable if they're both ethical and sustainable.
Thank you for that answer. And thank you, Philip Ling, for your question. I'm just gonna scroll here. So Yannick Rosal, she says, thank you so much, Phil. Great presentation. With COVID being less prominent now, do you believe that this change will be maintained long term, or that things may shift back to how they once were?
Yeah, well, I think, so there's two ways that I would answer that question. When I speak to people who are fishing, they say they don't want it to go back to the way things were. They learned a lot, and they've changed their businesses moving forward. The thing about COVID is that it's like, if you think back to that initial diagram of community capacity, it's not gone, but it's going to be another one of those stressors that, in concert with other things that are going on, diminish at certain times our ability to respond. And add it to the list of things that are already eroding communities' ability to respond. And so if, whether, some of these things, for example, are seasonal, whether it's a seasonal thing or whether it's more stochastic and unpredictable about when COVID strikes, we know it's going to, because we failed to keep it from becoming an endemic issue. So it's not gone. And we just got to recognize, okay, this is part of the mix now. That's part of one of the reasons that we're on our back feet, part of the deficit that we have in terms of responding. And that's not a doom and gloom answer. That's a just be aware of it and build that recognition into recognizing the support that people need. One of the things, and I'll stop after this, one of the things I feel like we learned that could deserve a lot more coverage in our response to COVID-19 was that universal basic income helps people respond to surprise. Because the places that had no strings attached support, the people who received no strings attached support, didn't just sit on their rears. They did something with it, and they solved a problem. Like people in fisheries, it was the people who were left coping and with no resources to do anything who were the ones who ended up being hurt. I feel like we learned a ton in our food system from COVID about the benefits of something like that. And so if we acknowledge this constant drum of if it's not one thing or another, what is our leverage point for taking a little bit of pressure off people so they can respond in more interesting and proactive ways? And, not advocating for specific policies here, but it is a lesson learned that I think that, we should talk about more.
Thank you. Thank you, Yannick, for your question. I'll just read out, there's a few comments here that I thought were worth sharing with you. So from Elaine Kennedy, she's a very active community member. She said, I feel a little more optimistic about the future when we have people thinking like you do.
Thanks.
We got a few hearts. And then from Philip Ling, he says, one of my takeaways is to be optimistic about our ability to adapt even to big shocks. I think there's like this a lot of positivity in what you shared tonight.
I'm glad for that. It's a constant struggle to not get sort of swept down. And what I always go back to this, whatever, maybe I'm fooling myself, but I would think I am, is that as a systems thinker, all of the signs around us suggest that we're actually right at the threshold of something major. And I could be wrong. Major changes. I could be wrong, but then I ask myself, how would I act? What is the difference in how I would act? But if I started with the assumption that all of this was too big to solve, compared to we're just about there, and then I decide to go with that one. And
I'm gonna sleep a little better tonight. I have another question from Anonymous. So how do you convince someone who is struggling to feed their family to care about climate change and sustainability?
I don't want that person to have to care about climate change and sustainability. I really don't. And that's one of the things that frustrates me so much about this deficit, the inaction politically. That is the role, that is the point of social contract. The reason that we have governments and that we decide to enter into a society with one another is that so people in circumstances like that have a pathway out. I love that people in that position are, and they're doing something about it anyway. And that's another thing that keeps me motivated, is realizing that there's people who are in far worse situations than I am, who are still fighting just as hard, if not harder than I am. And that makes me want to get up every day and fight harder. I don't want, the same thing I say in the past, when I've taught classes on sustainability, what I've said to people is a sustainable future world is not a world full of sustainability scientists. It's a world where people like me don't exist anymore. We don't want to have to, we shouldn't have to talk about it anymore. We shouldn't, and so what does that mean? That means I think there's an unequal burden on the people who can do something about it, to do something about it for people who can't.
Thank you, Phil. And I have one more question before we wrap it up. So from Melanie Ayat, she says, what are the most important steps a small community like Cornwall can take to mitigate and adapt to climate change?
I think the number one, there's so many different answers to this, because the problem is there's no silver bullet, right? And as a friend of mine, John Foley at Project Drawdown says, the silver buckshot. There's lots of solutions. And what I like to tell people is lean into the thing that you feel like you're really excited about. That being said, protect democracy more than anything else. I'm both American and Canadian citizen now, recently Canadian citizen. And of course, people on this call will no doubt be aware of the challenges that democracy is facing around the world and in the United States. We can't do it, and the correlate to that is protect democracy and start local, because as we've seen more than anything else, local politics matters so much. So that's my answer for that one.
Thank you. And thank you, Melanie, for your question. I think we could wrap it up here for the evening. So I'll just thank all the audience for joining in and tuning in, and everybody who's watching from Cogeco Your TV. So we'll be seeing you in September. We'll have a nice summer break, and I hope everyone enjoys your summer. If ever you have questions about the river or what's happening in the river, you have observations, feel free to send us an email. You can go to our website, riverinstitute.ca, or find us on Facebook. We love to hear your stories on the river. So enjoy your summer. And Phil, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Everybody, if you search Philip Loring and TED, you'll find his talk on YouTube, and you might enjoy that if you enjoyed this talk. So yeah.
Thanks so much. I really had fun.
Thank you.